A man found dead behind the bakery ovens. No witnesses, no motive, only flour-covered footprints leading nowhere. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love hearing from all of you. Comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. It's always a joy to read your replies and see this global mystery-loving family grow. Let's begin. It was a Thursday in late October, and the rain had begun not long after May Gray stepped out of the Quai d'Orfèvres. Not the stormy sort that comes in gusts and thunderclaps, but a soft, persistent drizzle that slicked the sidewalks and blurred the glow of the street lamps. He had left early that day, something he seldom did, and now found himself walking aimlessly, collar upturned, the brim of his hat dripping, hands deep in the pockets of his heavy overcoat. He didn't mind the rain. He minded the office less when it rained. It made Paris quieter somehow, slower, more itself. The city smelled faintly of wet leaves, tobacco smoke, and bread, always bread. Near the Rue Lepic, he paused before a small bakery whose windows glowed yellow in the gloom. He wasn't hungry, exactly, but the sight of round loaves stacked behind the glass and the memory of his wife's quiet insistence that he eat something warm today pulled him inside. There were two women behind the counter. One, younger, blonde, with a faint dusting of flour on her cheeks, gave him a polite nod. The other was older, perhaps 50, with eyes that had seen many days and didn't care to disguise it. Neither smiled. May Gray bought a small pain de campagne and a Tardeux Poems, wrapped carefully in white paper. He lingered just a moment, breathing in the scent of yeast and butter. "Long day?" the younger one asked, her voice polite but tired. May Gray gave a slow nod, noncommittal. "It's always long when it rains." She offered a faint, perfunctory smile. As he turned to leave, the older woman, who had remained silent, spoke for the first time, her voice rough as if from smoking or worry. "It used to be busier here," she said, not looking at him, as though speaking to no one in particular. He paused at the door. "People don't eat less bread now, do they?" "They eat elsewhere," she replied, brushing crumbs from the counter. "Or not at all." He left without answering, walking slowly, still without purpose. The Tardeux Poems was warm in his coat pocket. He might bring it to Madame May Gray, he thought. She'd smile in that quiet way of hers, always a little surprised that he'd remembered her sweet tooth. His feet took him, without intention, past the Place Pigalle, then down quieter streets where cafe chairs stood empty and water pooled beneath parked cars. He was still thinking of the bakery, not the bread. That had been excellent, he was certain of it. It was the voice of the older woman. There had been something in it, not bitterness, not even sadness exactly, but the weight of something unspoken. May Gray had long since learned to trust such feelings. Not to chase them, necessarily. They were like fog. You walk straight and let it surround you. Still, he made a small note to himself, mentally marked the street, the corner. He might pass by again, not out of duty, but out of curiosity, the kind that had nothing to do with crimes or cases and everything to do with people. Back at the apartment, Madame May Gray was reading a magazine by the window. She looked up and gave him a patient, knowing smile, the sort that said she'd been expecting him for 10 minutes longer than he'd taken. "I brought you something," he said, unwrapping the tart and setting it on the kitchen table. She took it without a word, only raising an eyebrow, as if she already knew there was more to the tart than just apples and pastry. "Do you know the bakery on Rue Lepic?" he asked. "I used to. The one with the green awning. That's the one. Something happened?" He shook his head. "Not yet." She smiled again, more fully this time, and poured him a cup of coffee. Outside, the rain continued, soft and steady. The next morning, the rain had stopped but left behind a lingering dampness that clung to the shutters and darkened the facades of the buildings. May Gray, arriving at the Quai d'Orfèvres just after 8, moved with his usual unhurried gait, nodding to the desk sergeant and taking the stairs instead of the lift. He hung his coat on the wooden peg behind his office door and sat heavily in his chair, the scent of pipe tobacco still fresh in the room from the night before. He lit a new bowl and took the first draw slowly, his mind not yet on paperwork or pending cases. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to the Rue Lepic and that small bakery. There had been nothing unusual, nothing that warranted police attention. And yet, he knew the city well, not in the way of maps or districts, but in the way one knows an old friend's moods. Something in that bakery had felled off, like a slightly sour note in an otherwise pleasant song. The older woman's remark had stuck with him. They eat elsewhere. Or not at all. Not bitterness again. More resignation. The kind that settled over a place like dust. Maigret stared out the window. From his office, one could see the Seine in fragments between rooftops, a slate-gray shimmer today. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray and stood. It wasn't a case. There was no report, no official reason. But still, he found himself picking up his hat and coat again. He told Janvier, who was sipping coffee by the file cabinet, that he was going out for a bit. Janvier didn't ask where. He'd long ago learned that Maigret's wanderings sometimes led to unexpected calls for follow-up, and other times to nothing at all. By late morning, Rue Lepic was awake, but not bustling. The bakery was there, the green awnings still damp, the windows slightly fogged. Inside, the younger woman from yesterday was serving a man in a gray coat who ordered without looking up. The older woman was again behind the counter, but this time seated on a stool, folding small white napkins into triangles. Maigret entered quietly. A bell above the door rang softly. The women both looked up. The younger smiled faintly, remembering him. "Back already?" she said. "You must have liked the tart." "I did," Maigret replied. "My wife more so." The older woman looked at him more closely this time. Her eyes were dark, not cold exactly, but used to seeing through pretense. She did not smile. She resumed, folding her napkins. "Coffee," the younger offered. "We serve it in the mornings." He nodded and stepped aside as the man in the gray coat left with his baguette. The place was clean, neat, though one corner near the front window was cluttered with unused trays and a broken display scale. Maigret took the small table near the door. The coffee came in a plain white cup, not very hot, not very strong. The older woman came over after a moment, her eyes still fixed, as if weighing him. "You're not really here for coffee," she said. He smiled a little. "I rarely am." She said nothing more, but sat across from him uninvited. There was no sign of curiosity in her face, only tired patience. "You're the police?" "Yes." She nodded as though she'd suspected it yesterday, then added, "I didn't think we'd made trouble." "You haven't," Maigret said. He paused. "I had a feeling," that made her lean back slightly. Her hands, cracked and red from years of baking, folded loosely on the table. "This bakery's been here since before the war," she said. "My husband ran it until he died. That was 58. Now it's mostly me and Elise." She gestured toward the younger woman, who was now restocking shelves, pretending not to listen. "Elise is your daughter?" "My niece. From Bethune. She came last year. The boy we had before her left." Maigret sipped the coffee. "Why?" The older woman shrugged. He didn't say. There was no accusation in her voice, only statement. A fact. Maigret had known bakers, grocers, butchers. The small tradesmen of Paris who kept odd hours and lived above their shops. They rarely left notes when they quit. But the boy's absence seemed a shadow here. No one said his name. No one referred to him beyond the necessary. "Your name?" Maigret asked gently. "Agathe Remillard." "And your niece?" "Elise Fournier." Agathe looked at him directly now, and Maigret, as always, waited, saying nothing, offering no pressure. Just the weight of silence. People filled silence in different ways. Some babbled. Others confessed. "You're wondering about the boy," she said after a time. "Jerome." He let the name hang in the air. "He worked here 6 months. Knew his way around dough, not customers. Didn't talk much. One day, he left the keys and didn't come back. That was in May." Maigret nodded slowly. "No note? No call? Nothing. We didn't report it." She seemed almost embarrassed by that. He understood. Young men left Paris all the time. Sometimes for better jobs. Sometimes for worse things. Unless they left blood behind, few people came asking. Elise took over after that. Mid-June, Maigret stood, slowly, setting a few coins on the table. Agathe didn't touch them. "You'll come again," she said, not quite a question. He nodded. Perhaps. Outside, the clouds had returned. Maigret walked slowly, lighting his pipe again, letting the smoke curl around him like a scarf. Rue Lepic sloped downward toward the city, and far off, he could just make out the spire of St. Eustache. The bakery, with its green awning and its silence, seemed smaller from across the street, a place half invisible to most. At the corner, he paused. There was a tabac there, with two men playing cards inside. He bought matches he didn't need and asked the shopkeeper if he knew the bakery well. The man looked up from magazine. "The Remillard place?" "Sure. Good bread. Quiet folk." "That old woman, Agathe, never talks unless you ask. And the boy, Jerome." The man gave a small shrug. "Didn't like him much. Bit strange. Kept to himself. But good with pastries. Haven't seen him in months. Heard he went south. To work? Maybe." A shrug again. Maigret nodded, pocketed the matches, and walked on. He didn't know yet if something had happened. There was no crime, no missing person officially listed. But he felt it, the way one feels a draft before the door opens. Something had shifted just slightly beneath the surface, and he would keep watching. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would visit again. The following day, Friday, was colder. The kind of cold that made the walls of old Parisian buildings feel damp to the touch and the metro car windows fog with breath. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres early, but left even earlier, a file tucked under his arm more as a formality than out of necessity. He had signed 2 reports, refused a third for lack of substance, and told Janvier once again that he was just going out for a walk. There were murmurs, of course. There always were when Maigret detached himself from the predictable rhythm of cases and paperwork. Inspector Lognon, ever the complainer, had muttered something about ghosts in bakeries as Maigret passed his desk. Maigret didn't bother responding. He let the door to the building close softly behind him and turned his steps, again, toward Montmartre. The Rue Lepic was quieter on Fridays. The vegetable seller was arranging crates of carrots with a gloved hand, and the fishmonger 2 doors down from the bakery was hosing down the pavement, his boots splashed with icy water. Maigret approached the bakery with the deliberate slowness of someone not intending to interrupt anything, only to observe, to be present. Inside, Elise was alone behind the counter. She looked up, blinked once, and gave him the same tired half-smile. "Back again," she said. He nodded, taking off his hat. "It's good coffee. You're the only one who says that." "I'm polite." She gave a small laugh, not mocking, but not warm either. "Agathe's in the back," she added. "Meeting." Maigret nodded, but didn't ask to see her. Instead, he stepped aside and took the same small table by the door. The bell above him rang softly as another customer entered, a man in his 60s with a cane and a newspaper under one arm. He bought a brioche and left without a word. Maigret sipped the coffee Elise had brought him. It was exactly the same as yesterday. Tepid, weak, but comforting in its ritual. From his seat, he could see the back corridor that led to the kitchen, the tiled floor worn pale in the center from years of shuffling footsteps. He waited until Elise returned to wiping the glass display. Then he asked, casually, "Did Jerome ever come back?" Her hand froze on the cloth, just for a second. It was subtle. Most wouldn't have noticed, but Maigret did. Her eyes didn't meet his right away. "No," she said, continuing to clean. "He left in spring. May, I think. No goodbye, no word. Did you like him?" She shrugged. He was quiet. "That's not an answer." She glanced at him then. "I didn't dislike him." Maigret let silence take over. Elise returned to her wiping, but he could feel the tension in her shoulders. She wanted the conversation to drift, to move on, but he knew better than to rush. People revealed themselves more in what they avoided than in what they said. "Elise," he said after a minute, "why do you think he left?" This time, her hesitation was longer. She folded the cloth over slowly, as if stalling. Then she leaned on the counter slightly and lowered her voice, though the bakery was empty. He didn't like Agathe. He thought she watched him too closely. He said she had eyes in the back of her head. Did she? Elise gave a dry laugh. Probably. She sees everything. And did she give him reason to leave? I don't know, she said. But there was something in her tone. Not uncertainty, but restraint. She knew more, or at least sensed more, than she was saying. Just then, the back door creaked, and Agath appeared, wiping her hands on a striped cloth. Her presence filled the space quickly, not loud, but definitive. You'll frighten the customers, Inspector, she said, with only the faintest edge of humor. There are none to frighten, Maigret replied, standing to nod politely. She said nothing to that. Her gaze flicked between him and Elise, measuring something unspoken. Elise busied herself behind the espresso machine. Maigret finished his coffee and put the cup down. Do you mind if I speak to the boy's last employer? He asked. Before you, I mean. Agath raised an eyebrow. Jerome came to us directly. Said he'd worked in Lyon. A patisserie. Didn't give a name. No friends in Paris? Not that I saw. She was firm, but not hostile. Still, Maigret had seen this performance before. The gatekeeper role, common in families, in small businesses, in places where people circled their wagons around secrets not because they were dark, but because they were private. Would it trouble you, he said slowly, if we looked into where Jerome lived? Agath didn't blink. He had a room on Rue de Rantin. Rented it from a woman named Marceau. I don't know if he paid the last month. That, Maigret thought, was telling. People didn't mention unpaid rent unless the subject had come up recently, or still mattered to them. He nodded and thanked her, placing another coin on the counter. As he stepped out, he glanced once more at Elise. She looked back briefly, eyes careful. There was a tightness there, not fear exactly, perhaps guilt, but not the kind of guilt born of action, more the type that came from knowing something and never saying it. Rue de Rantin was only a 10-minute walk, up the hill and just off the more frequented paths of Montmartre. Maigret stopped at a corner cafe to warm his hands before continuing to number 42, a gray building with a chipped facade and a bell that buzzed rather than rang. He climbed to the second floor and knocked. The door opened cautiously. A woman in her late 50s, with dyed auburn hair and a knit shawl around her shoulders, peered out. Yes, Madame Marceau? She nodded. Chief Inspector Maigret, I'd like to ask about a former lodger of yours, a young man named Jerome. At the name, her eyes narrowed slightly. What about him? You were his landlady? Unfortunately, he took the small room facing the courtyard. Paid on time the first few months, then vanished in May. No word since. None. Left the key in the lock. Didn't take much. Did he say where he was going? No. Just disappeared. Quiet boy. Polite. But odd. Old. She looked him over, deciding how much to say. He asked strange questions, she said finally. About tenants. About the layout of the building. I caught him once just standing in the hall in the middle of the night. Maigret frowned. Was he ever violent? No. But he made people uneasy. One of the girls downstairs. She said she thought he was watching her. I told her it was probably nothing. But I started locking my door after that. Did he have any visitors? None that I saw. Maigret thanked her and asked to see the room. She fetched a set of jangling keys and led him down the narrow hall. The room was barely more than a closet. Single bed, narrow window, cracked linoleum floor. A faint smell of old tobacco clung to the walls. Nothing's been touched, she said. No one wants it. Maigret stood in silence for a long moment, breathing it in. The stillness of the space. The lingering sense of departure without closure. Not a disappearance with urgency, but one done in haste. There was no violence here, but there had been fear. Or shame. He turned back to Madame Marceau. What was his surname? She hesitated. Jerome Letellier. Maigret nodded, repeated it softly to himself, and left the apartment without further word. Outside, the wind had picked up again, stirring the smell of distant baking bread into the street. But now it seemed colder, less comforting. He began walking slowly toward the quay. There were things to look into, names to check, files to scan. But he felt the thread now, just beginning to show at the edge of the fabric. Something was unraveling. Not a crime, perhaps, Not yet, but something was wrong. Back at the Quai d'Orfèvres, Maigret sat quietly in his office, the smell of his pipe curling like a question around the room. Outside the window, the rain had returned, a lazy drizzle sliding down the glass, turning the rooftops of the Isle de la Cite into smudges of gray and black. The heating pipes clanked once, then fell silent again. He had taken off his coat, but not his hat, a habit he often kept when deep in thought. On his desk lay a single file, thin, half-complete, bearing the name Letellier, Jerome. John Vere had done what he could with the records, but there wasn't much. A birth certificate from Lyon, a mother listed as deceased, no father named, a short record of apprenticeship in a pâtisserie in Villeurbanne. One prior job in Paris, 6 months in the 14th arrondissement at a boulangerie that had since closed. No police reports, no hospital visits, no criminal record, no forwarding address. The sort of boy Paris forgets in a week. Maigret flipped through the sparse documents again. He lingered on the identification photo, a black and white image clipped from the apprenticeship file. The young man had a narrow face, thick eyebrows, lips slightly parted. The photo wasn't formal, more likely taken for an internal file than for any official purpose. But it had a strange quality, a look of caution, as if Jerome wasn't ready for the moment the shutter clicked. Maigret studied the face for a long time. By mid-afternoon, the drizzle had turned to proper rain, and Maigret found himself standing once more outside the bakery on Rue Lepic. This time he didn't enter. He watched instead from beneath the canopy of a closed cafe across the street, smoke drifting from the bowl of his pipe, now lit again. The bakery's routine was as predictable as the rain. At precisely 4, the school children began to appear, small hands gripping coins, mothers waiting just outside. Elise served them quietly, efficiently. Agathe was nowhere to be seen. Maigret waited until the street had emptied again, and then he crossed. Inside, Elise was sweeping near the ovens. The air was warm, thick with the scent of butter. "Back again?" she asked without looking up. "Yes." He held out the photograph. "Do you recognize him?" She took the photo in her hand, and this time the pause was longer. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her face changed, just slightly. The small muscles around her mouth tightened, and her eyes blinked once, too slowly. "Jerome," she said. Maigret said nothing. She handed the photo back. "Where did you get it?" "Apprenticeship record. He's from Lyon." Elise gave a tiny nod, then returned to sweeping. "You two were close?" Maigret asked after a moment. "No, not really." Again, not an answer, just a refusal. Maigret let the silence return, heavier now. After a moment, she stopped sweeping. "He was strange," she said finally. "Not bad. Just, he never spoke about himself. He was always watching." "Watching?" She looked down. "Listening, mostly. He'd ask questions about Agathe, about the bakery, about who owned what. At first I thought he was just curious. But then he started leaving at odd hours. Early mornings, sometimes late at night. Did Agathe know? She didn't say. But she knew. Maigret studied her. Did she confront him? Elise hesitated. There was a fight. One night. I didn't hear all of it, but she raised her voice. First time I ever heard her do that. What about? I don't know. After that, he was gone within 2 days. Back outside, the street was beginning to darken. The yellow lamps flickered on one by one, their halos reflected in the puddles on the cobblestones. Maigret walked without hurry to the police archives on the Boulevard du Palais. Inside, the air was dry and stale, filled with the smell of paper and dust and ink. He signed in, made a note of the Letellier name, and requested any references linked to ownership, tenancy, and small commercial disputes. It took some time. The clerk shuffled through old folders, retrieving ledgers and typed memos, some dating back decades. Maigret flipped through them slowly, one after the other. He found it on the second hour, a brief entry in a dispute from 1959. A property transfer filed under Remillard, Claude and Agathe, co-owners of a boulangerie on Rue Lepic. The dispute had been minor, an unpaid delivery settled quietly. But the file included ownership documentation, and one note stood out. A handwritten marginalia from a city clerk, Airship question unresolved. Prior family link mentioned, but not pursued. Maigret reread the line. He sat back, frowning. A family link? Someone disputed as heir? He made a photocopy and signed a register. It was getting late now. He decided not to return to the quay just yet. Instead, he turned back to Montmartre. Agathe opened the door before he knocked. She was still in her flour-dusted apron, her sleeves rolled up, but her face was clean, and she looked tired. Not the tiredness of work, but the kind that comes with waiting. "I thought you might come back," she said. "May I?" She stood aside. The kitchen smelled of yeast and cleaning solvent. A large bowl sat half-covered in the corner, dough rising beneath a tea towel. Maigret removed his hat and sat without being invited. He placed a photocopy on the table. She didn't reach for it. "You had a son," he said. Silence. "Did Jerome know?" She didn't answer. "He was your son, wasn't he?" Still nothing. The ticking of a small wall clock echoed in the quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the window panes. "I think he came to Paris to find you," Maigret said. He didn't say it. He watched, asked questions. Maybe he didn't even know for sure. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, as though unused to being heard. "He was born when I was 17. My parents sent him away, to a cousin in Lyon. I wasn't allowed to speak of it. And later, my husband never knew. We tried to have children. It never happened. And then he arrived." She nodded. "I recognized him the first day. You said nothing? What was I supposed to say?" Her voice was sharp now, suddenly brittle. "He was a stranger. He didn't call me mother. He didn't ask me anything. He just came. You argued. I told him to stop snooping. He'd asked the least questions. Read papers in the back room. I was afraid. I didn't want him to make trouble. What did he want? I don't know." She sat down slowly, heavily. "Maybe he just wanted to see if I'd admit it. But I didn't. I told him if he kept acting like a thief, he should leave like one." Maigret let the silence settle again. "You know where he went?" she asked after a long moment. "No, not yet." She nodded slowly. Her eyes glistened, but did not spill. "He looked just like my father. I hadn't expected that." Maigret stood, slowly. "If I find him, I'll tell you." She didn't answer. She stood and walked to the sink. Her back to him. Outside, the rain had become a fine mist. The bakery lights glowed behind the curtains. Somewhere up the hill, a piano played through an open window. The streets were nearly empty. Maigret walked slowly, hands deep in his pockets. There had been no crime, no body, no complaint, but guilt hung over Rue Lepic like the damp in the air, invisible and inescapable. And he knew, now, that the boy hadn't vanished without a trace. Not from memory, not from blood. The next morning, Maigret took his coffee at home with Madame Maigret. She had made him soft-boiled eggs, and they sat quietly at the kitchen table, as they often did, exchanging only the simplest of remarks. About the weather, the market, a neighbor's dog barking again too early. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked finally, not looking up from her knitting. He stirred sugar into his coffee. "I'm not sure what I was looking for." "That boy, yes." She nodded once and resumed her work. It was their way. She never pried, he never withheld, but the space between the two was not filled with speculation. Just calm presence. She waited, and he went on. "He may have been her son," Maigret said, after a while. She never acknowledged him. And he left. Yes, in May. Madame Maigret set down her knitting needles, folded her hands gently in her lap. "It's a shame," she said softly, "to find what you were looking for and not be recognized." He didn't respond. Instead, he looked out the window at the gray courtyard below, where a cat was trying to drink from a rusted drainpipe. By mid-morning, Maigret had returned to Rue Durantin, hoping to find something more in the little room where Jerome had stayed. Madame Marceau let him in with a huff of impatience. "You again?" "Only a few minutes," he said. "Just a look." The room was unchanged, empty save for a narrow bed, a chair, a small desk scarred by cigarette burns. He checked the drawer again, but there was nothing inside, not even a scrap of paper. But the desk itself was unsteady, and when he pressed along its underside, he felt something give, He reached up and pulled loose a folded square of cardboard, tucked under the top panel. A photograph. It was old, black and white, curled at the edges. A woman, younger than, unmistakably Agath, seated on a low wall beside a man with a cigarette in his mouth. Between them, a boy, perhaps 5 or 6, with thick eyebrows and a slight squint, grinning despite the sun in his eyes. Maigret turned it over. No writing, no date. But the paper was brittle, the kind used by studio photographers in the 40s or 50s. He slipped the photo into his coat pocket and thanked Madame Marceau on the way out. She didn't ask what he'd found. At the Quai d'Orfèvres, he ran Jerome Letellier's name again through the records. Still nothing new, but a note had come from Lyon. A contact there had confirmed that Jerome's adoptive cousin had died in 1958, and the boy had then been in state care for several years. No known biological family was listed, though there had been vague mentions of a mother who had refused recognition. The phrase made Maigret's jaw tighten slightly. He wondered how long Jerome had known. If he had suspected for years, if he'd come to Paris with a purpose, or if he had simply wandered into the bakery by chance and seen something familiar in Agath's face. But he doubted it had been chance. Jerome had come looking for something. That much was clear. He left the office again by mid-afternoon, raincoat over one arm, and turned back toward Montmartre. The air was sharp, and a breeze carried the scent of coal fires, mingling with the faint perfume of chestnuts roasting from a vendor cart at the edge of the square. As he reached Rue Lepic, he saw that the bakery was closed. Not unusual, some shops shuttered between lunch and late afternoon. But something about it made him stop. The lights were off, the chairs inside stacked. No sign on the door. He knocked once lightly. No response. Across the street, the florist was tying brown string around a bouquet of lilies. Closed early? Maigret asked her. The woman nodded without looking up. Agath's niece wasn't feeling well. They closed just afternoon. Maigret stood a moment longer, then walked on. Later, he sat at a zinc-top table in a small bar off the Boulevard de Clichy, watching people pass beneath umbrellas. He nursed a beer, untouched for nearly half an hour. In his coat pocket, the photograph still rested, heavy in its silence. He took out once more, smoothing it gently. The boy in the photo, he must have been younger than Jerome had ever remembered. But the face was unmistakable. He had been smiling. It was dark when he returned to the bakery. The shutters were still drawn, but he noticed a light flickering upstairs. He rang the bell. After a moment, the door opened a crack. It was Elise. She looked pale, the shadows under her eyes deeper now. "Is Agath here?" he asked. She hesitated. "She's resting. I need to speak to her." Another pause. Then Elise nodded slowly and let him in. The bakery was quiet, the smell of flour and old butter lingering. Upstairs, the apartment was modest. Neat, worn furniture, a ticking mantel clock, framed photographs in muted sepia. Agath sat by the window in a wooden chair, wearing a gray cardigan. She looked older than she had the day before, her face sagging slightly, as though a weight had pressed down on her in the night. "I found this," Maigret said quietly, and handed her the photograph. She didn't reach for it right away. When she finally did, her hand trembled, and she brought it close to her chest. "Where?" "In his room, Rue du Hontin." She stared at it for a long time. "He kept it," she said. The words barely formed. Maigret didn't answer. "He must have found it when he was older. It was taken just before they sent him away. I thought it was gone." "You knew he had it?" "No. I burned all the others." Her voice cracked. "I was afraid someone would find them. My husband, the neighbors." Elise said there was an argument. Agath nodded. "He asked me if I knew who he was. I lied, told him I didn't. But he already knew. He didn't cry. He didn't accuse me. Just looked at me like he saw through everything." "Why didn't you tell him the truth?" "I was ashamed and afraid. I didn't know what he wanted. I thought maybe he was here for money. Or revenge." "Was he?" She shook her head. "He left a note." Maigret looked up. Elise had entered the room now, holding a small folded paper. "I found it this morning, in a recipe book. I think he put it there the night before he left." Maigret took the paper carefully. It was written in neat, uncertain handwriting. I know who you are. I didn't come to punish you. I just wanted to see your face. You don't owe me anything. I won't come back." Maigret folded the note and placed it beside the photograph on the table. Agathe said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the glass, where rain was starting again, softly, trailing down the panes like lines on a page. "I'll look for him," Maigret said quietly. "If he's still in Paris, I'll find him." She gave a small, helpless nod. Then, in a voice barely audible, "I hope he does come back, even if I don't deserve it." Maigret stood, his hat in hand. Elise walked him down the narrow staircase without a word. At the door, she paused. "He left something else," she said. "In the attic, an old suitcase. I didn't tell her. I wasn't sure." "I'll look at it," Maigret said. "Tomorrow." She nodded, closed the door gently behind him. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest. Maigret pulled up his collar and turned toward the metro. He didn't rush. The night was quiet, the streets mostly empty, save for the sound of tires hissing through puddles and the occasional bark of a dog in some distant courtyard. Somewhere, Jerome Letellier was still walking the city, and Maigret, as always, would wait. Saturday morning came late. The sky was thick with low clouds, the kind that threatened rain but never delivered, only held the city in a muffled gray. Maigret didn't go to the office. He called in, left word with John Vere that he'd be making rounds, and brewed his coffee at home, listening to the creaks of the building and the faint rattle of trams across the bridge. Madame Maigret had gone to the market. She left him a note. Apples, milk, a small roast for Sunday. Underneath, in different handwriting, was the name Letellier and the word attic. He smiled faintly at her habit of keeping him organized, even in the midst of things he never fully explained. By mid-morning, he was back at the bakery. The green awning was still rolled down, the glass front dim. A simple handwritten sign read, "Closed for the day." Elise opened the door without a word. She looked calmer this time, not less tired, but steadier, as if something had resolved itself during the night. "She hasn't left her room," she said, leading Maigret through the darkened shop. "I didn't tell her you were coming." He nodded. They moved silently through the corridor behind the ovens, up the back stairs to the second floor, then another narrow stairwell, this one steeper, leading to a low wooden door. The attic smelled of flour, old cloth, and dry paper. The roof sloped sharply. Light came in through a small round window, streaking through the floating dust. Elise pointed to a corner beneath the beams. It was tucked behind the flour sacks. I only noticed it because a mouse had torn through one. The suitcase was brown leather, cracked at the corners, the handle worn to bare stitching. Maigret crouched beside it and opened the clasps. They clicked softly, like a memory being unlocked. Inside was not much: a few folded shirts, threadbare underthings, a shaving kit with a broken mirror, a pair of worn shoes wrapped in newspaper, and beneath it all, a packet of letters bound with twine. Maigret pulled them out and sat on a low wooden stool. Elise hovered nearby, uncertain whether to stay or go. He glanced up and nodded. She sat on a trunk and watched quietly. The letters were from a woman named Clemence, 5 in all, addressed to Mon Petit J. The handwriting was fluid, affectionate, yet cautious. They dated from the previous year and came from a return address in Lyon. Maigret read them slowly. The first few were filled with small details. Memories of shared meals, encouragements to keep working, a mention of a birthday passed unnoticed. But the fourth letter shifted tone. "I understand now. You don't want comfort. You want answers. If you go to her, be careful. Not everyone is waiting for you the way you are waiting for them." And the final letter, dated just a month before Jerome's disappearance. "Whatever you find, it won't be what you imagine. People change. People hide. Don't let their silence swallow your heart." Maigret folded the letters carefully. "Do you know her?" he asked. Elise shook her head. "No, he never mentioned anyone. Never even got mail here. I think he had them sent to the cafe down the street. The waiter brought them once by mistake." "Do you remember the name?" "La Civette, just past the grocer's." Maigret stood, brushing dust from his coat. "I'll stop there." Elise followed him down the stairs, but paused at the bakery door. "You think he's still in Paris?" I think he left something behind, Maigret said. People like him don't vanish. Not completely. She hesitated, then added, he never told me he loved her. But I think maybe he thought it. Maigret gave a small nod and stepped outside. The café was ordinary, one of dozens like it across Montmartre, with tin tabletops, mirrored walls, and a rack of week-old newspapers by the till. The waiter, a tall man with sharp elbows and a tired mustache, remembered Jerome vaguely. Quiet fellow. Always ordered café creme, never sugar. Sat by the window. Read poetry sometimes, or at least pretended to. Only spoke to the old man who plays chess out front. Did he ever get mail? The waiter scratched his head. Once or twice. Always tucked it away fast like it was private. No return mail. Never saw him post anything. Maigret lingered long enough to drink a coffee and watch the street. The city had its weekend rhythm now. Slower, unhurried, lovers and tourists blending with locals, children skipping past lampposts, dogs sniffing the corners. At a bench across from the bakery, the chess player was indeed still there, his pieces laid out on a checker cloth. Maigret approached him. Mind if I sit? The old man looked up and shrugged. No one's challenged me in a week. They played half a game before Maigret asked, Did you know the boy? Jerome. The old man made a move without looking up. The one who stared too long. Maigret nodded. Watched people like he wanted to draw them, but didn't have a pencil. What did he say to you? Not much. Once asked me if I thought people could really change. I told him only the lucky ones. He laughed. Maigret looked at the board. He was losing. He said he came to Paris to see someone. I thought he meant a girl. Did he ever mention a name? The old man frowned. Clemence, maybe? Or Claire. Something like that. But he didn't talk much. Where did he go? Left in a hurry. Came one morning with a bruise on his cheek. Looked like someone had said something that broke him. Didn't stay long after that. Maigret stood slowly. Thank you. Did something happen to him? Not yet, Maigret said. But something will if I don't find him. That evening, back at home, he read the letters again. Madame Maigret had dozed in her chair, knitting still in her lap. He watched her for a while, the way the light touched her hands, the soft rhythm of her breath. People changed. Yes, but slowly, and sometimes they only changed when no one was watching. He reached for the telephone and dialed the line station, asking them to trace Clemence. It would take time, but he had time. The rain started again, steady, thin, quiet as guilt. The next morning, Sunday, Maigret F.O. UND himself in bed later than usual. Madame Maigret, already dressed, had opened the window a crack to let the air in, despite the cold. He could hear the distant bells of St. Eustache ringing the hour, muffled and slow, like a church remembering something it couldn't quite name. He stared at the ceiling for a while before rising. There was no urgency to the day, yet something in him stirred. Not restlessness exactly, rather a sense of presence, of something hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for acknowledgement. The case, if one could call it that, had no files, no formal number, no deadlines. Only a boy's absence, a woman's silence, and a lingering smell of yeast. Over breakfast, hard rolls, soft butter, and a slice of cold ham. Madame Maigret asked, Did you sleep poorly? No, Maigret said. I slept well enough. I dreamt of bakery, not Rue Lepic, one from my childhood. I hadn't thought of it in years. She looked at him over her teacup. Was it a good dream? I'm not sure. They ate in silence after that. Outside, the city was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet unique to Sunday mornings, when shops are closed, shutters drawn, and even the pigeons seem to pause. Maigret didn't go to the bakery that morning. He walked instead. First along the Boulevard Haussmann, then past the shuttered department stores, then up through the 9th, where cafes were just opening for brunch. At a small square near Pigalle, he sat on a bench and lit his pipe. He thought of the suitcase again. Not what it contained, the shirts, the letters, but what it signified. Intention. Jerome had not left in panic. He had hidden the case, tucked the letters away, left a note. Quiet, deliberate acts. And then there was the bruise. The one the old chess player had mentioned. Maigret had seen nothing of it in the photo, but of course, the photo was old. He took out his small notebook and reviewed the order of things. Jerome arrives in Paris in December. He begins working at the bakery in early January. In May, he disappears. Before leaving, he hides his belongings and writes a note. He never contacts the bakery again. There was no theft, no threat. No one had reported anything missing. But what, then, had broken the boy's resolve? By early afternoon, Maigret stood once again at the door to the bakery. It was closed, as it had been the day before. But Elise answered quickly this time, as if she had been listening for the knock. "She's up," she said, "but not dressed. I told her you might come." Maigret nodded. "Did she say anything about the suitcase?" "No, I didn't tell her. May I speak to her?" She hesitated. "She hasn't been herself today." "She hasn't been herself in years," Maigret said gently. Agathe sat in a dark room, just off the corridor, near a curtained window. She wore a woolen shawl and slippers, and her hair was pinned back more loosely than before. On her lap, a rosary rested, unused. "I was hoping you wouldn't come back," she said quietly. Maigret pulled up a straight-back chair. "I thought you might want to know what he left behind." "I don't. I think you do." She looked away. He took the photograph from his coat and set it on the table between them, the same one she had held 2 days before. He kept this with him, hidden. It's the only one he had. Still, she said nothing. He didn't come to accuse you, or to ask for anything. He came to look, to see if you'd recognize him. That was all. Her hands, resting on her lap, gripped the rosary tighter. "I sent him away twice," she said at last. "Once when I was 17. Again when I was 58. She looked down. "He was always silent, even as a child. But I knew what he wanted. He wanted to hear me say it. Just once. Why didn't you?" She shook her head, a tight motion. "Because I didn't know how to begin. What do you say to a boy you abandoned?" "I'm sorry." "It's not enough. It's never enough." Maigret let the silence grow. The tick of a clock in the hall marked the moments, but he didn't move. "He asked me if I believed in second chances," she said finally. "I told him life isn't a book. It doesn't let you revise the pages." "And what did he say?" "He said I must be tired to think that way." Maigret allowed himself the smallest of sighs. "Do you think he'll come back?" "No," a pause. "But I wish he would." They sat in stillness after that. There was nothing more to say. After a while, Maigret rose. At the door, she spoke again, her voice brittle. "Do you believe in redemption, Inspector?" He turned. "Only in small doses. And usually with coffee." She smiled faintly, and for the first time, Maigret thought he saw the girl she must once have been, strong, stubborn, too afraid to admit fear. Outside, the streets were waking again. Churchgoers moved slowly past shuttered shops, and the smell of roasted meat began to seep from second-floor windows. Maigret walked aimlessly for a while, turning corners at random, his thoughts not fixed but drifting, as they always did when a case was nearly finished but not quite closed. At the corner of Rue de Rantin, he saw a figure seated on a step outside the old building. A man, head lowered, coat buttoned to the neck. At first, he thought nothing of it. Then he stopped. The man looked up. His face was pale, thinner than in the photo, but familiar. The same eyebrows, the same quiet eyes. "Jerome," the young man nodded once. "You're the policeman." Maigret didn't sit, but he didn't move either. "I saw you come and go these past days," Jerome said. "I didn't want to be found, but I stayed close." "Why?" "I want to know if she'd care enough to look." "She didn't," Maigret said, "but she regrets it." Jerome looked away. "Do you still have the letters?" Maigret asked. A slight nod. "Yes. And the suitcase. I knew Elise would find it. She notices everything." Maigret took a step closer. "Are you leaving?" "I was. I haven't decided. There's nothing holding you here." "Except her," he said, and his voice trembled. "I don't want anything from her. I don't want to disappear entirely." "You haven't," Maigret said. "Not to her." He handed him the photograph. "She wants you to have this." Jerome looked at it for a long time. "She never gave me one. She didn't know how." ##, the young man nodded, folding the photo carefully, like something fragile. He stood. ##, will you tell her I was here?" ##, no, Maigret said. "That's your choice." Hashtag. They stood quietly in the gray afternoon. Two figures in a city that rarely stopped long enough for moments like this. Then Jerome turned and walked away. Not quickly, not like someone running, but like someone who didn't want to leave a trace. Hashtag. Maigret watched him until he turned the corner. Then he lit his pipe and walked in the other direction, the smell of bread rising faintly on the air. Hashtag Monday came as Mondays do. Slow, wet, and full of half-spoken greetings at the Quai d'Orfèvres. Maigret arrived with little fanfare, hung his coat with a heavy sigh, and stared for a long time at the cold pipe resting on his desk. He didn't light it. The room smelled of ink and old cigarette smoke, as always, but today it seemed stale, tired, like a blanket that had been wrapped around too many sleeping bodies. Hashtag. John Vere poked his head in just after 10. Anything urgent today, Chief? Only the rain, Maigret replied. And perhaps a young man who isn't sure if he wants to be found. Hashtag. John Vere raised an eyebrow, but knew better than to ask. Hashtag. Get me the address file from Lyon, Maigret said, more to the window than to his subordinate. The one with the Foster homes. There's a name, Clements. No surname yet. Hashtag. John Vere nodded and disappeared. Hashtag. Maigret stared out across the river. The sky was heavy, the water below dull and swollen. Boats moved sluggishly along the Seine, loaded with timber and crates. Everything felt weightier than it had 2 days before. He wasn't sure what exactly he expected to do now. Jerome had appeared, not officially, not with answers, but he had shown himself. And yet the mystery remained, like the aftertaste of bitter coffee. Why had he stayed hidden for so long after leaving the bakery? Why wait? Hashtag. He had said he didn't want anything from Agath, and Maigret believed him. But there was more than just pain there. There had been hesitation, and something else, something resembling fear. Hashtag. Around noon, Maigret stepped out into the rain and walked, once again, toward Montmartre. His feet knew the way now. The bakery had become less of a destination and more of a fixture, like a lamppost on a familiar street. Not always noticed, but always there. Hashtag today, the awning was up and the window lights were on. A woman stood inside, buying 2 croissants and a café, Olette to take away. Elise served her with her usual quiet efficiency, and Maigret waited until the woman left before entering. Hashtag. The bell above the door chimed softly. Elise glanced up, then gave him a small, almost smile. You're starting to know our schedule better than we do. Hashtag. Do you ever sleep? Hashtag. I sleep fine, she said. It's other people who key me up. Hashtag. He nodded. Is Agath here? Hashtag. She's downstairs, kneading dough. She said she didn't want to be disturbed today. Hashtag. Maigret took his usual table. I won't disturb her then. Hashtag. Elise brought him a coffee without asking. It was still weak, still not quite hot, but somehow comforting in its ritual. Hashtag. Did you see him? She asked quietly. He looked at her. Yes. Hashtag. She nodded as if she had known. He came last night. Sat across from the bakery. Didn't come in. Hashtag. Did you speak? Almohadilla. I didn't want to break it. Hashtag. Break what? Hashtag. The stillness. Hashtag. Maigret sipped his coffee. He's not angry with her. Hashtag. I know, Elise said. But she's angry with herself. She stood for a moment, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small wrapped package. He left this. Told me to give it to you if you came back. Hashtag. Maigret accepted it. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. He undid it slowly, revealing a notebook. Soft-covered, creased, the kind that fits into a coat pocket. Inside were pages of neat writing. Hashtag. Jerome's handwriting. Hashtag. The first page was blank. The second began mid-thought. She didn't see me, not really, even when I stood in front of her. I kept wondering if she would smell something. Not my scent, but a memory. People remember through smells more than anything. Bread, soap, old perfume. I thought she might catch something from me, From my clothes, maybe? That would make her stop pretending. Hashtag Maigret read in silence. Elise stayed nearby, not reading over his shoulder, only waiting. Hashtag the entries continued in fragments. Observations, snatches of dialogue dates. April 3rd. I left the bakery early. Walked to Park Monceau. Sat for an hour. Thought about asking her again, but she didn't look up when I left. Hashtag April 17th. She said, the yeast isn't rising today. But it was. She just didn't want to bake. Hashtag May 2nd. She told me to stop acting like I knew things I couldn't possibly know. I didn't answer. I just went upstairs and packed. Hashtag the final entry was short. Just 5 words. Hashtag I almost knocked, but didn't. Hashtag Maigret closed the notebook gently. He writes like someone afraid of his own voice, he said. Hashtag Elise nodded. He always whispered, even when he didn't have to. Hashtag he loved her. Hashtag I know. Hashtag they stood quietly again. Hashtag finally. Maigret placed the notebook in his coat pocket and said, tell her I was here. And tell her she still has time. But not too much. Hashtag he walked back slowly, stopping at a cafe that faced the square. He didn't sit, just watched the bakery through the steam of his breath. At some point, Agath appeared in the window. She wasn't working, just standing there looking out. Hashtag he couldn't tell if she saw him. Hashtag later, back at the quay, John Vere brought him a slip of paper. Hashtag from Lyon, he said. Only one Clements on file linked to Letellier. Clements Bonnaire. Died last year. Cancer. No surviving family. Hashtag Maigret looked at the paper a long time. That's the one. Hashtag John Vere waited, then asked, so, was there a crime? Maigret shook his head. No, just a silence that got too big to carry. Hashtag he stood, stretched his legs, and looked out over the river again. Hashtag sometimes, he said, people disappear not because they're lost, but because no one ever said they were found. Hashtag John Vere didn't quite understand, but he didn't ask again. Hashtag that night. As rain tapped gently on the window, Maigret sat at his kitchen table, reading through Jerome's notebook again. Madame Maigret placed a blanket over his shoulders and poured him a small glass of brandy. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Hashtag the city outside was quiet, wrapped in mist. The kind of night when all that mattered, or had ever mattered, was whether a light was still on in a window. Hashtag by Tuesday morning, the city had taken on that pale, flat light that arrives after several days of rain. Not sunlight exactly, but a thinning of the gloom. Paris looked washed, almost dazed, like a face rinsed in cold water. The shop signs were brighter against the damp facades. The cobblestones looked slick but clean. The bakery on Rue Lepic was open again. Maigret waited until the morning rush had passed. By then, school children had already run through with their centimes and crumbs. The neighborhood regulars had taken their small paper sacks under their arms, and the ovens were quiet for the moment. The smell of yeast and scorched crust still clung to the walls, warm and intimate. Hashtag Agath was alone behind the counter when Maigret entered. Her eyes were hollow but clear, and she gave him a faint nod, one that acknowledged his presence without surprise. She looked like someone who had been through a storm and was not yet dry. Hashtag, there's no more brioche, she said quietly. People came early today. I'm not here for brioche. Hashtag, I didn't think you were. Hashtag Maigret removed his hat and stepped to the counter. She leaned against the back wall, arms folded. No one else was in the shop. Hashtag, Elise told you? Hashtag, she did. Hashtag, she also told me you spoke with him. That he gave you something. Hashtag, Maigret reached into his coat and pulled out the notebook. He set it gently on the counter. She didn't reach for it. Hashtag, did you read it? She asked. Hashtag, yes. Then you know. Hashtag, I know enough. Hashtag, she looked away, her eyes fixed on a crack in the tile. I told myself for years that what I did was necessary, that I was young, alone, frightened, that there wasn't any other way. And maybe that was true, but it didn't make the absence smaller. Hashtag Maigret waited. In his silence, she seemed to steady herself. Hashtag, he didn't look like me, not at first. I saw his father in him. But when he watched me, when he didn't speak, I saw myself. I saw the same stubbornness, the same silence. He didn't come to hurt you, Maigret said gently. Hashtag, I know. Hashtag, she stepped forward then, not quite touching the notebook, but letting her fingers rest near it. I don't know if he'll come back. Hashtag, he will, once more. Hashtag, how can you be sure? Hashtag, Maigret offered a small, dry smile. He left this behind. Hashtag, later, he walked through Montmartre, passing a street performer tuning a cello, a woman feeding pigeons from a cafe window, two boys laughing over a broken bicycle. Life had resumed its usual rhythm, but Maigret felt something had shifted, not in the world, but in the air between people. A door had been left ajar somewhere. A silence had been filled, however imperfectly. Hashtag, he ended his walk near the Square des Abysses. From here, one could look down over the rooftops of Paris, as if the city were folded in on itself, timeless and unhurried. He lit his pipe and thought about bread. Bread was a curious thing, ordinary, necessary, but intimate. You could tell a lot from a loaf. Whether it had been rushed, whether the baker had been tired or inattentive. The crust spoke of heat, the crumb of patience. A good baker knew how to wait. Hashtag, he wondered if Agathe was kneading dough again, if her hands had found their rhythm, if the yeast had risen without fear. Perhaps not yet, but someday. Hashtag, that evening, Maigret returned home early. Madame Maigret had made veal with carrots. They ate together with the radio, playing faint music in the background. He didn't mention the bakery, and she didn't ask. But after the dishes were cleared and the brandy was poured, she sat down beside him and said, simply, hashtag, you found him. Hashtag, yes. Hashtag, and the mother? Hashtag, she knows she lost him. That might be the beginning. Madame Maigret nodded and rested her hand on his arm. They sat that way for a long time, not speaking, the window open just enough to let in the sound of distant rain gutters and the hum of quiet footsteps below. On Wednesday, the bakery's display was full again. Baguettes in neat rows, croissants stacked like golden petals, loaves of pain to campaign dense with seeds. The early crowd came and went in routine murmurs. Bonjours, merci, au revoir. At 8:15, Maigret stood once more before the window. He didn't go in. He watched. Agathe was behind the counter, moving slowly but with care. Elise was arranging pastries, speaking softly to a child who couldn't decide between almond or apricot. And then, just before 8:30, the bell rang again. Jerome entered, coat damp from the drizzle, hair slicked down. He paused, uncertain. Agathe turned, saw him, and did not speak. She looked at him for a long time, then walked from behind the counter and stood in front of him. No apron, no barrier. He said something Maigret couldn't hear from outside, and she shook her head, not in refusal, but in disbelief. And then she reached for him. It wasn't an embrace. Not yet. But her hand touched his sleeve, and he did not pull away. She said something else. He nodded once. Behind them, Elise turned the sign in the window from ouvert to ferme temporairement and drew the curtain halfway. Maigret turned and walked on. The street was quiet, and the bakery behind him began to fill with the sound of voices not meant for the world. At the Quai d'Orfèvres, Longtime stopped him in the hallway, frowning. I hear you've been chasing ghosts up in Montmartre. Maigret shrugged. Ghosts make good bread, if you treat them gently. Longtime rolled his eyes and walked off muttering something about pastry and poetry. In his office, Maigret sat down, lit his pipe, and pulled the notebook from his coat pocket. He didn't open it, just ran his hand over the cover, once, then tucked it into the drawer. There was no report to file, no arrest to make, just the knowledge that something broken had not been fixed, perhaps, but it had been acknowledged. and sometimes that was enough. The city outside moved on. Buses rumbled across the bridges. Clerks shuffled papers. Children returned from school. And somewhere on Rue Lepic, a woman made space for one more loaf on the shelf. It was early Thursday morning, and the fog had returned, thick this time, clinging low to the rooftops and muffling the sounds of a waking Paris. Even the barges on the Seine moved like shadows. Maigret stepped out of his apartment building and paused for a moment on the pavement, collar turned up, pipe cold in his coat pocket. He hadn't lit it yet. He didn't feel the need to. A kind of quiet had settled in him. Not the tired quiet of sleepless nights or unsolved cases, but something gentler like the hush that follows rain. He walked slowly, not toward the Quai d'Orfèvres, but again toward Montmartre, not to investigate, not even to observe, but, as he might have said to Madame Maigret, just to walk. He arrived on Rue Lepic just after 7. The bakery windows were misted with condensation, the light inside faint but steady. The door was closed, not yet open to the public. He stood across the street for a time, not moving. The city around him began to stir. A delivery man wheeled crates past the grocer. A woman with a green umbrella crossed the square. At 7:30, the curtain inside the bakery shifted. A figure, Elise, moved past, adjusting the trays in the front display. A moment later, Agathe appeared. She was in her apron, hair pulled back tight. She moved more slowly than before, but her movements had a steadiness to them now. Not habit, but intention. And then, from behind her, Jerome stepped into view. He wore a white coat now. His hair was tied back from his face. He wasn't working the counter. Not yet. But he carried a tray of unbaked rolls from the rear to the front oven, hand steady. Maigret didn't smile, but he felt something close to it, something soft and unfinished in his chest. He turned and walked on without entering. Later that morning, back at the Quai d'Orfèvres, he sat at his desk with a cup of lukewarm coffee and stared at the stack of files waiting for his attention. The window was open a crack, and from somewhere down the corridor came the murmur of telephones, shoes on tile, the scratch of pens. Life moving forward. He pulled out Jerome's notebook again, not to read it, but to hold it once more. The cover was worn now at the corners. He didn't need the words inside anymore. He had memorized the rhythm of the boy's thoughts, the hesitant way he wrote, the hope stitched between the lines. He set the notebook aside and opened his drawer. Inside were half a dozen small, unfiled photographs, ones he kept for no reason that would hold up under bureaucratic scrutiny. A woman who had vanished from Belleville, later found alive and ashamed. A retired postman who confessed to theft after 40 years. A girl who watched her mother lie to the police and said nothing, eyes wide and dry. He added Jerome's photograph to the group. At midday, Janvier knocked on his office door. "Lunch, Chief." Maigret stood, stretching slightly. "Where?" "There's a new place en rue des Petits Champs." Italian, apparently. Maigret made a face. "Too much garlic." Janvier grinned. "You're not wrong." They ended up instead at a corner bistro near Châtelet, the kind with check tablecloths and a waiter who'd been there longer than most of the buildings around him. Maigret ordered boiled beef with carrots and a glass of red wine. He ate slowly, savoring each bite like a man who wasn't sure when he'd be hungry again. "You really think he'll stay?" Janvier asked between mouthfuls. "Who?" "The boy. From a bakery." Maigret chewed, swallowed, and took a sip of wine before answering. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether she lets him knead the dough properly." Janvier frowned. "You're not serious." "I am," Maigret said. "There's a way to shape a loaf, to fold and wait and fold again. It's not just flour and water. It's patience. It's trust." Janvier didn't reply. He had learned, over the years, that when Maigret spoke in metaphors, it was best to let them hang in the air. That afternoon, Maigret received a small envelope at the quay. No return address. Inside, a single photograph. Jerome, in profile, looking down at something out of frame. A candid shot. His white apron was dusted with flour. The caption on the back, written in an unfamiliar hand, read, "He remembered how to wait." There was no signature. Maigret slipped the photo into his drawer beside the others and leaned back in his chair. He didn't say anything for a while. By early evening, Paris had turned gold again, not bright, not dry, but touched by a slow, amber light that softened the corners of the streets and turned the puddles into mirrors. Maigret walked through the Place Dauphine and watched the chestnut trees shed their leaves. He thought, not of cases, not of crimes, but of the way his city holds people. How walls remember. How silence can be passed down like heirlooms. He stopped at a bookshop just off the quay and bought a new notebook. Not for himself, for someone who might need it. He wrote nothing inside, only slipped a card in the front with his name, in case the boy ever wanted to talk again. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table with Madame Maigret, he told her about the photograph, about the envelope, about the bakery. She listened, knitting in her lap, as always. Then she looked at him and said, "There's something sad about people who can only speak in silence." "Yes," he said, "but there's something beautiful in it too, if someone listens." And they sat together, as the lamps flickered on outside and the city exhaled, quiet and full of lives still unfolding.